Good morning again. Oh, hold on, let me set up here. Good morning. It is Friday. I'm back with another episode. It's still very weird to say episode, but technically this is like my podcast. It gets shifted over to the podcast platform, but it's another episode of How to Align with Transformation. So where you can essentially build a lifestyle of recovery and recover your life through attending to your mental health. I got to work on that one. So it is September 6th. It's post Labor Day. Excuse me, I just put water in my ice, ice in my water. And it is time to talk about the seasons of change, because I try to choose my topics of what I'm going to talk about kind of aligned with what the general consensus is of the sessions that I have with people, just kind of common denominators. And then, of course, it's like valid points for how you start to prioritize your mental health within your lifestyle and accomplish, battle all of the internal conflicts of perfectionism and capitalism and all the isms. We are in a season right now that we need to talk about it. And there's a couple of things that are in that season. One is the actual season, so that's why I called it Seasons of Change. Another one is a political election season. And then we're just generally going to talk about change. So let's just unpack those things just a little bit. So let's start with just the seasons, because I started talking with my clients about around this time. Most people associate the end of summer, beginning of fall to be the actual fall solstice, which I believe is like mid-September. However, that is not really based in science a whole lot. It's more based off of like general seasons, but our bodies and our minds respond to the shift and change of light, and not necessarily just the date of a season changing. So what I really wanted to bring up today is that what do we start to do around this time, and what do I see a lot with people's behavior, as well as just, general life. Everyone gets to choose how they want to live. However, some things that if you deal with depression, if you deal with anxiety, some of the things that I would recommend start doing now. September 6th. My vitamin D supplement is in my cart on Amazon, and it will be ordered by the end of the day, because this is where, like I said before, we respond to light. Our brain responds to external stimuli. And a date is one of those stimuli, but what's even more powerful than a number on a piece of paper in a calendar of time that we all don't actually follow is the light. And so about probably I'd say 2 or 3 weeks ago, I started noticing the days are, it gets darker earlier. It's still dark. It's still light for a pretty late amount of time. But I go ahead and tell people, because we're all generally vitamin D deficient, especially if you deal with mental health anyway. And go ahead and start taking your vitamin D supplements. If you want to go get your vitamin D levels tested, by all means, that would be a good first step. But if your mood shifts around this time with seasonal affective disorder and all that, go ahead and start it now, because it's going to happen. This is the thing about mental health that I think, and recovery, that is very difficult, because there's so many things that, one, we naturally cycle. And if male versus female, that's a whole other topic that I have to talk about. But we naturally cycle through life, and that's where we are tied to the seasons. We're tied to the earth. So being able to have that relationship with nature and understand how it can influence you, but then also prompt you to be able to flow with it, will help immensely. So that is our first season of change coming up, is really just the light changing. So being in a time period preventatively, go ahead and start the vitamin D supplement. You can also, if you're not really wanting to take a supplement, certain foods around this time can help. When you start looking, do a little bit of research on foods that are high in magnesium, B12, vitamin D. These are your fish. Like I eat a lot of tuna. because it's also high in protein, but then also high in vitamin D and omega-3s, very good for brain health, that will help you not have as much of a big swing during this time if seasonal affective disorder is something that impacts you, okay? Then you also have to look at, and because this is what I see with a lot of people who struggle with depression, because they're in a cycle. We get attached to this cycle, but a lot of it becomes anticipatory. So when I'm talking about this, be very mindful of like how it's like, oh gosh, yeah, seasonal affective disorder. How reactionary are you to the time of this season and this change? Because I think a lot of people have a lot of conditioned responses around this time that go into the outcome of having a lower mood, a depressive episode during the winter months. And a lot of it is really just psychological attachment to knowing it's going to happen. And it's harder to break. That takes some work, but it really, the work is making sure you realize, oh yeah, I'm in anticipation mode versus preparation mode. You can go back and listen to the difference between those two in one of my other talks, anticipation versus preparation, because it's where I talk about the biggest difference is that the mindfulness component of like, oh, I know this is my pattern and I'm not reacting to it versus like, I'm about to get seasonal affective disorder and you're anticipating it. So the difference is you're mindful of the fact that it is a scary pattern to be aware of, but you're not letting that particular emotion, that fear, drive it, because we will confirm our own bias with that particular fear. Okay. So the first season of change is the season. So you are still in a place where, you can get outside, you can still get your vitamin D from the sun. It's getting a little chilly, even in North Carolina. So, being able to get out first thing in the morning, introduce yourself to the sun for 5 to 10 minutes in the morning, if possible. If you're someone like me who gets up before the sun, you have to make sure that you get outside sometime in the earlier morning or afternoon to be able to get that exposure, especially because I work from home. So this is very important for people who have transitioned into this hybrid schedule or from home, in order for us to be able to absorb that very vital nutrient for mood regulation and just for general overall anxiety and stress. Because the next season that we've got going on right now is fully related to stress. It is an election season, okay? So this particular season, any election season is going to have a higher level of inflammation to it. There's a lot of news on, there's a lot of people who are watching the news, who are internalizing this. This is a very significant election for us too. For the United States, but it's, there's, on top of a couple of wars still going on, there is a lot of stress. And your stress management, this is where we're going to see probably a lot of people default back into maladaptive stress. What I mean by maladaptive stress management, let me finish my sentence, is it is more of a short-term response to stress, or it's, when I use the word self-destructive, I don't mean that you're going to self-destruct immediately, but we see a higher level of drinking going on, drug use during this time, because it is stressful. And that is a conditioned response for the brain to know, oh, this is going to handle this stress. This will help me get through it. The problem is that that's also a double whammy to my first point, whereas that we're already in a cycle of change, whether we add an additional external stressor or not. And that adding a substance is maybe even a triple whammy, depending on how much and also how many multiple substances that you influence into your body. Now, with a compassionate approach to this, some of this is not all your fault. It's not a moral shortcoming if you fall back on substances during this time. It is literally just your brain being like, ooh, efficiency. What helps me feel better right now? Alcohol. What helps me feel better, and it will help me feel better long-term? Alcohol. The problem is that is a dysfunctional thought pattern in your brain, and it is more a survival pattern. It is not allowing you to consider, okay, what else do I have to get done in the day? What else? How do I need to feel tomorrow to be able to approach my work that doesn't actually make me feel defeated? Because when it's for a lot of people, alcohol, makes people feel better, be able to sleep, but it is actually a short-term resolution because it shortens the amount of time that your body actually rests, because whether you want to call it metabolization of alcohol, it just numbs your nervous system, so you're not actually fully in a restful state, that it doesn't actually help you sleep that great. Hate to break it to you, but I understand it's not just that easy to stop that, and I wouldn't recommend someone just stopping cold turkey unless you have some kind of support system in place to be able to accommodate that change. It can also cause a lot of stress in other areas of your life within, support systems. Marriages can also get a little bit tense around this time. If I'm also thinking about this, there's a lot of different schools. Where I grew up and when I grew up, we didn't have year-round schools, but this is also a time when kids are going back to school. For a lot of parents, that's a relief. And as much as I love my job, but there are some downsides to my job, and it's with this next point. As much as a relief as your kids are going back to school, it is still a change and a drop in your attention to how to maintain the level of functionality that you are maintaining. So although this may be a really great thing for parents to be able to experience your kids going back to school, you don't have to keep them busy all day, it is stressful. Now you have a drop in your body's functioning that you're not prepared to actually ease off of that level of stress. So this is where a lot of people start getting sick, because your immune system is kind of dependent on the level of stress that you're operating in. And I know that is kind of jacked up in a lot of ways, but it's kind of true, is that when we're in a high level of stress and we're used to that level of stress, whenever we have a relaxation period, this is actually a pretty significant point of defeat for a lot of people, is because we get sick. And then your body's like, oh, we can rest. But it's kind of a pseudo rest, because either within 3 to 5 days, because vacations are not usually more than like 7 to 10 days, do we have to kind of get back into the swing of things. However, not taking a break, I'm not recommending don't take a break. I'm recommending having a set plan for when you guys take vacations, or whenever you have a transition period, like kids going back to school, or like an election year where you're exposed to everyone else's stress and all of the sharing of opinions during this time. And how are you going to protect your mental energy, your emotional energy, and your physical energy? Because isolating is also not necessarily the only option that is healthy for you. Isolation can be good, protecting yourself from that exposure to, conflict and all that, but you also don't want to get so isolated that you are hypersensitive to conflict and you start to avoid things, because it's really not a choice at that point. It's just your brain's way of protecting itself, because that's what the brain does. It is a self-protecting entity. And so when it sees oh, I don't want to deal with conflict, you start to, it literally is telling you to avoid conflict. And then that becomes also a social stressor. It seems and this is I love my job, but it also I have to deliver information sometimes that's a little bit negative. It's you never feel like you're doing good enough. But I promise you, everything is good enough if you're doing something. Something is better than nothing. So that first point of getting on a vitamin D supplement to help the internal response system to stress and how you manage stress, and working on your food right now, as we're about to now. Before, if you live in North Carolina, it was too damn hot to go out and move your body because it was extremely oppressively hot. But now there's also going to be a potential drop in temperature, which doesn't make it very lucrative to get out and move and help your immune system be able to regenerate and prepare for all these different types of stressors that we are around. Okay. So that was my second point. The first point was literally the season of change. And the exposure to light is dropping, so be prepared with vitamin D. The second one is just a general season of stress right now with a political, an election year, people transitioning back. It's just felt everywhere. I was at a meeting with the school that I volunteer with, and I could feel it myself. And I was like, ooh, I need to get on my own plan. That's why I said the vitamin D is in my Amazon shopping cart. It will be bought, because I can feel my own response to stress, as well as I have a season of just general change. And so that's my third point for y'all to think about when we talk about seasons of change. It's not only just the season, it is the change in itself. Change is a good stress, but really my main point here is I want y'all to remember is that there's literally everything changing around us, whether we realize and or are intentional with change at all. So there is this stress that we feel that can actually like drain us, but then there's good stress, which was what we call eustress, EUSTRESS, where it is that short-term investment stress of like, okay, I need to do something different, I need to do something hard up front. So then in turn, the long run, it maintains and it has a system of change. But there's also different levels of change and things that lead up to change. And so being able to identify just what cycle and or stage of change you are in the cycle of change. And if you want a reference for that, you can go into my app, and I have in the resource library is a worksheet about the stages of change. I also did a video on it, I believe, where I went over the different stages of change, and just being able to ground yourself in your mind in the knowledge of like, okay, I'm on the road to change. So for me, I have been, well, I feel like I change like quite often and every single day, because as a business owner, you literally have to be able to pivot at any drop of the dime sometimes. But being able to be like, okay, I didn't get what I want. The outcome was not the change that I intended, but where am I in the process so I can mentally stay focused on the goal, which the goal is to see this big change in my life. So I did this. The biggest obvious point here is when I did this with my physical body and releasing weight. And it was really a matter of like, okay, so an example of this would be, okay, so my goal is to, when I was working towards this goal, was to be under 200 pounds. And when I was like 260, in the years that I was trying to drop below 200, did I look at, okay, whenever I went out to eat with my friends and I had a cheat meal, or for me, it was really a binge episode that I had to monitor, was, okay, how am I still in line with this outcome? Well, my binge episode was binging on rice cakes and peanut butter, or foods that still fell into, and I prepared to be able to binge. So if you go back and refer to the 5 stages of change, pre-contemplation, contemplation, preparation, action, and maintenance, there is a relapse in there, but it's not always needed. But I am still technically in preparation. My action, I am in an action phase because I'm on my way to being under 200 pounds, but I am still technically doing an old behavior that could actually set me back. But mentally, instead of being like, oh my gosh, I'm defeated, I lost my goal, I should just give up, and doing that all or nothing black and white thinking, I am like, you know what, this is one day, and I deserve to eat pretty much whatever I want. That was also part of my goal, was to have food freedom and still be able to obtain my goal. Could I have attained it in a shorter amount of time? Yeah, probably, if I didn't have those binges, but I didn't make that plan like that because I really wanted to see myself aligned with transformation. So I took my time. So I identified the fact that I was more in a preparation. I kind of defaulted back to, well, I prepared these foods to be binge worthy. So I'm not just binging on a whole bag of chips, or I'm not binging on a whole pizza. I'm binging on things that still keep me in line with my goal. Because for me, and this is kind of can be explained a lot more in my course, but the relationship with food is what kept me grounded in my mental health, because I was actually fueling my body with foods that actually helped me long term. So short term, I deviated. Technically, short term, I deviated from the immediately goal of just staying on a rigid food plan. Long term, still in line with my goal because I had already prepared myself for those moments. I guess it's pretty much more of like observing a whole lot of people, and then also my own trial and error over the years, where I already knew that I was going to fail. I already knew I was going to have days where I wanted to eat a whole bag of chips, and if that had to happen, it was going to happen. I already accounted for it. So if we can get our minds wrapped around just the stages of change and being able to identify that we're still in line with our goals, your brain has a less likelihood of defaulting back to those old neural pathways, where those belief systems of I'm not worthy, I'm not capable, I don't believe in myself, where they grab hold of us, because that can be tricky to get out of. So here's just your general accountability to go over and check out the resource library. look, you can even Google the stages of change. It's not, don't have to go through my app at all, but it's really just, it's identifying, can I, like, okay, metaphor downloading right now, right? So let's imagine you were on the side of a cliff. Sorry, that's a little extreme of an example so far, but wait, hold on for me. You're on the side of a cliff, and you know those in the movies where it's like people, like they're falling, or they're on the side of a building where they're just like sliding down the building, and essentially there's nothing to grab onto, and they're just falling. And we all hate that feeling. If you ever have that dream where you startle awake because you're falling, I can analyze that for you another time, but no one likes that feeling. To be able to get out of that feeling, you have to have, there's that one moment where they just like slam something into the middle of the cliff and they're able to like wedge it in some small ass crack that is just like, what? Oh my gosh, they're saved. They're not sliding down the rock anymore and off the face of the cliff. That's ultimately what you're doing with your thought process when you're looking at something to say that you're in line with the long-term goal. Short-term is probably the hardest thing to wrap our brains around when we're actively feeling a feeling. And there's also why my addiction background helps with mental health, is because we get addicted to feelings all the time. The fact is we also deny that we're addicted to those feelings and then ultimately get stuck in them even more because we're not actually able to move forward in understanding like, oh, how do I get out of this feeling? How do I develop and have that relationship with that so I can be like, oh, that's you. This is what I'm going to do, and I don't say overpower it, but essentially get your brain back online to your prefrontal cortex to be able to do some more executive functioning thinking. Sometimes it takes some time, but that is the metaphorical explanation I have of like, if you're sliding down that cliff, looking at the stages of change and making sure you realize, okay, this is one day in my journey where maybe I wasn't as productive, but I also know that I can shift everything, and be able to accommodate having to be of a lower energy that day. And if you can get your focus on where you are in the journey, then you're more likely to pick up the next day, maybe the other day, depending on what your life is throwing at you these days, and be able to still stay on track to your goals long term. Progress is not linear, I promise, unfortunately. Like it is, there's plateaus, there's ups, there's downs, but being able to get that stake in that little crack and save yourself from falling off the cliff, it is imperative for you to ground yourself in reality, not only so in your body and practicing that mindfulness, but then also that intellectual mindfulness of looking at constructively, okay, I'm still in preparation mode. I had to fall back to be able to move forward. Okay. So that is the stage or the seasons of change right now. We've got a season shift going on, exposure to light. UV light, if you guys have any, there are some lights that you can order that help with light exposure inside if you do happen to live in like a more northern place. Seasonal affective disorder was really tough for where I'm from in New Hampshire because it's cold, so your sun could be shining, but if it's, 17 degrees outside, you're not going outside a whole lot. So sometimes you have to have those UV lights that help with light exposure. These ring lights, since you can't see, these are not UV lights. That's not UV. So this is why sometimes people tan. Those are not UV lights either, but it can be helpful for just to have light absorbed. But this is, if it is cold, cold plunging can also be stressful, so I'm not always recommending that, but being out in the cold can help regulate the central nervous system as well. So getting access to that light and starting to, it doesn't take too long to develop a new habit, but work backwards from the stages of change to see if you can develop the habit of just getting outside and seeing the sun for the first 5 to 10 minutes of your day. Having your coffee outside will make such a difference for how your mood is able to sustain in these winter months where it's in cooler temperatures. You'll be okay. And I also wouldn't necessarily, this is kind of thrown in there. A lot of times people reach for accountability with their support system. It's kind of it's a blessing and a curse. It's what your support system's there to do, but I don't always recommend using your support system around this time because you will just be exposed to if they happen to be the ones that have to fall off or if they have a schedule change, your success is now tied to their pattern and not your own. So you're actually kind of overexposed to a pattern that you already have to deal with yourself, if that makes sense. So this is a time, to get comfortable and do it on your own. Get that access to light. The second point was politics. If you need to protect yourself during this time, stay in tune with what's going on, because voting is very important, more at the local level right now, but definitely at the federal level. But staying in touch with the news, either reading it or listening to podcasts that are a little bit more protective of all of the fear mongering and specific other stories that are just scary right now. We also did just have another school shooting in Georgia, which is very scary as well. However, this is where it's like, my mission in life to reduce the trauma footprint kind of comes in weird ways, because I actually have a training with law enforcement, school resource officers next week, not necessarily in Georgia, but to help them understand, like, why are all of these things happening, the mental health component. So that's exciting. That's good change. But to kind of summarize my last point is that even good change can be stressful. So being prepared with a stress management plan that is, moving your body a little bit to release any absorbed stress. Meditation, if you can do it, do it. If you're not a meditation person, I challenge you to start trying to just get your thoughts out on paper. You don't have to read them. You don't have to reflect too much. Just free conscious writing and journaling, because keeping it in here is really what perpetuates your aversion to doing the things that you know are healthy for you, like taking a vitamin D supplement or eating, because a lot of times people start to restrict eating in the winter. You would think they eat more. Some people eat more in the winter, but a lot of times people restrict because it's not as nice out anymore. The summer body time, you don't show it off as well. You can hide it under baggy clothes. If that's your cycle, I'm not knocking it, but I look at patterns. Like, I'm trained, addiction is more of a pattern of thinking and acting. So I would say that it's probably a little bit maladaptive if you struggle with anxiety, if you struggle with body dysmorphia, if you struggle with just being a human. If you struggle with having a brain, hit me up and I can explain a couple of things for you and hopefully give you some new routines to focus on during this time, because the seasons of change are upon us all the time, but specifically during this time of going into fall, at least in America. Can't speak for any, it's a little bit easier, I would say, on the West Coast because their weather stabilizes a little bit more, but it still happens. It still happens everywhere, north, south, east, west. So that's what I got for y'all for your accountability for mental health recovery, taking small steps to be able to get ahead of this. So I will see y'all in 2 weeks, probably. Yeah, 2 weeks, I think. But of course, if you want to see me more frequently, you guys can get in some of my program and go through the app and hit me up, and I can introduce you to what that membership structure looks like, and you can get your accountability on a day-to-day level. But yeah, I hope you guys have a good Friday. Happy post-Labor Day and early fall, because in the South it's a fake fall and I'm thoroughly enjoying it. So, and yes, I've already had 2 pumpkin spice cold foams. I don't do lattes. I ain't that basic, but you guys have a great day, and